Okay, I think I'm recording, so let's go ahead and give this a start here. Well, hello, my name is Gannon Larson, and today I'll be giving you all a brief introduction to the Coordinated Management of Meaning Theory, otherwise known as CMM. It's a very complicated and very dense theory, so I'm going to do my best to provide just a quick introduction to the theory itself and the principles behind it, as well as the different claims with it. So let's dive right in. So, what exactly is CMM? Well, it is very complicated. Oh, also, before I forget, to follow along with this presentation, please start in chapter 6 on page 65 in our textbook to follow along. But CMM, to start things off, is a very complicated theory. There's a lot of a lot of different moving parts and pieces that combine together to make this really interesting and fascinating theory. And it's kind of poetic in a way because, and as we'll see later, CMM proposes that communication in general between people is a very, very complicated endeavor, and it's not always we'll never be able to find the exact truth in conversations because of how complex communication is naturally. So, additionally, it's important to know that CMM runs counter to the traditional transmission model. And again, to reiterate, the transition model is picturing communication as a transfer of meaning. So it's being transferred to a source by sending a message into a receiver. So it's more something you just transmit. Whereas CMM says that communication is a constitutive force that creates social realities. And we'll get to those two things later in this presentation. But generally, CMM says that communication is constitutive, meaning we are building something, and that something is social realities when we are communicating with other people. We are creating all sorts of different things, interpretations, perceptions, how we feel about certain people, events, and things and ideas, and all these things create social realities that we live in, and they change from person to person, and they change all the time. And again, this theory was created by Barnett Pierce and Vernon Cronin in the mid 1970s as it was first debuted in their really interesting and groundbreaking 1980s article titled Communication, Action, and Meaning, the Creation of Social Realities. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. And again, so this is a quick little profile of who they are. So this is on the left side, you have Barnett Pierce, and on the right side, you have Vernon Cronin. They're both PhDs, and they're working. I forget. I believe it's a college in Missouri, but I'd have to double check. But they, unfortunately, Barnett passed away in 2011, but Vernon, I believe, is still working at that same institution. So CMM, as complicated as it is, can be boiled down to four major claims. These four being our communication creates our social worlds. The second being the stories we tell differ from the stories we live. The third being we get what we make. And the fourth being get the pattern right and we create better social worlds. And we'll be going into more of these as we go on through the presentation. But for now, let's start with what social realities are. And we're going to get back to this painting in just a moment. So, the creation of our social universe. So, the way people communicate is often more important than what they are saying. And the words we say and the things we do has an afterlife. Now, these social worlds and universes, if you will, are things that we as humans create with one another that absolutely alter and change and affect our perceptions and ideas about other people. So, in a sense, we are social constructionists in a pluralistic world because these worlds are constantly changing. It's not just one world. We are creating all these different worlds that change between different people, and it's kind of weird to think about. But imagine this. Let's say you and I, we have a disagreement on a lot of things. We don't agree typically on a lot of ideas, and we just can't seem to get along. Well, in your and I social world, we're gonna not like each other the best. We're not gonna think the best things about each other. But let's say one of my best friends who we get along with and we have the exact same ideologies and thought process in my best friend's social world, I'm gonna be a very different individual. Maybe I'll be a lot more interesting and liked and a lot better of an individual. So these creation social worlds are created by talking and absolutely affect our perception of other people that we talk with, and it has an afterlife. So let's say again, you and I have a disagreement, and we don't talk for a long time. You're gonna think down the road like, man, that Gannon guy was like kind of a jerk. But the people that are in my life that I have different interactions with might think, wow, that Gannon guy's not half bad. He's an interesting guy. And so this is best described, and I believe it's on page 66 or 67 in the book. This painting right here is called Bond of Union, and it shows that what we say intertwine, and our worlds intertwine with the people we interact with, and that's illustrated by the ribbons that are intertwining with the two different faces there, and those different bubbles. You could argue represent the different social worlds that are being created around us. And I kind of like how they're called social realities because, again, it changes our reality and our perception of the world around us. So it really is kind of like a whole new reality in a different world. And those combination of those different worlds create a social universe, as Pierce suggests. So the second claim is the stories told differ from the stories lived. And we'll get to the LUUUUTT model, or I like to call it the loot model, in just a moment. So, one of the important ideas to CMM likes to propose is that when it comes to stories told versus stories lived, one is about language and one is about our actual body. The stories that we tell are, and you can go to page 68 and 69 as well if you're following along. The stories we tell are designed for so we can try to make sense of the events we saw around us. So they may not exactly be exactly what happened, but there's certain extrapolations that are made, interpretations, and all sorts of things that are made when we are telling about something that happened to us. It is innately in a different story in a different social world. Like, shoot, lost my train of thought there. um, but because the fact that we are talking about these things, it's very different than the ones that we go through and actually live through, because that's more about a little bit more about objectivity and the things that actually happen and why those things happen, especially when it comes to the why or the trying to make sense of it all, is might be vastly different from person to person. So that is why when we are telling stories, they're very, very different than the ones that we actually live through. So it's important to note about coherence. And coherence is stories told are tales we tell ourselves and others in order to make sense of the world around us and our place in it. So that's again, that's kind of going back to stories told. It's all about that idea of coherence as well as coordinating. We're coordinating our actions together and meshing our lives together, just like in the painting. A bond of union, where we are literally meshing our lives together by communicating with one another and living and telling these different stories. Now, Pierce also goes in and calls that everything that is relevant, that is not or cannot be said, is known as mystery, because we, as a interpreter, we don't exactly know what those intentions are when there is a story. We don't exactly have all the facts, and someone that gives the story as well that even lived through it doesn't either. And that's again going back into this notion that there is no correct truth. Like we're not trying to find the correct story. Like there is no correct interpretation or correct story, that just doesn't exist. And that's why this theory is really, really complicated. So if we want to go back to the loop model, so we have lived stories, unknown stories, untold stories, unheard stories, untellable stories, stories telling, and stories told. And lived stories are what we actually did in the past or are currently doing. Unknown stories are information that's missing. So what do we not know when a story is being told? Untold stories are what, as a storyteller, what we choose not to say and why. Unheard stories is what we say that isn't heard or acknowledged. So what is being said, but what is not being heard or acknowledged in any sort of form. Excuse me. Untellable stories are stories that are, as the book says, forbidden or too painful for us to tell. We have our reasons for not telling a specific story. Maybe it's traumatizing or, so on and so forth. So it's important to recognize those when it comes to communication, as well as storytelling itself, which is the manner in which we communicate. Um, and finally, the stories told are what we say we are doing. So after we take into account all these stories, that affects the story that we end up telling to others. So not only do we have to examine how we are telling the story, meaning our tone, what we are saying, the perceptions we have in there, what our goal is with the story, but as well as the story looking at after we have said those words and that story has been told. And again, like as Pierce said, language has an afterlife. So we have to examine and look at the sort of consequences and ramifications that we have that are created when we share that story and when we hear stories from others. So then that back so on a little bit here on page 70, we go into something called logical force, which is the moral pressure obligation a person feels to respond in a given way. And oftentimes it's an automatic response. So we'll go into this in a little bit, but we look at something called the serpentine model. And in logical force, typically, let's say someone insults me or gets me really upset, the automatic response is be like, what the heck? Like, well, that's not very nice. That's kind of rude. And like that, or and some people might just be, immediate anger or different different choice words we might use, So and that's all up logical force is those. It's the way we feel we need to respond a certain way when we hear someone say something else. So we also have coordination, which again goes into the name of the CMM theory, the coordinated management theories, because coordination is working collaboratively to bring into being out vision of what is necessary, noble, and good, and what to preclude the enactment of what we fear, hate, or despise. So it's important to not only for us to talk about and when it comes to trying to figure out our differences, especially if we disagree, it's important for us to bring out what we feel is necessary and what we feel is noble and good, but not to enact on those things that we fear and hate or despise. And finally, we have coordination without coherence. That's synchronizing our actions even if we don't share the same motives. So we have cooperation. Essentially, it's cooperation for different reasons. We might all have a similar end goal or a similar idea when it comes to something, but we may all have different reasons. So let's say for instance, a hot topic, and the book talks about it. A very hot topic is like gun control. So let's say you have two people and they both agree that there needs to be more restrictions on gun control, but their reasons for wanting that same outcome might be vastly different. And the same thing goes for the opposite. And let's say there's a couple of individuals that think that currently the way that guns are handling is totally fine and there needs to even be less restrictions. Well, they may both have different reasons for wanting those things. Maybe one says that they feel it needs to be for protection and the other one just feels that it's harder to access different weapons if they feel that they need them and they feel like that restriction should be less. So it's important to examine when people take stances as well as when they communicate with one another if there exists coordination first off and coordination without coherence. And then here's the serpentine model, which is on page 69 in our textbook. So the serpentine model, we see here too, we have Wilson and Larry, and they seem to have a disagree. I believe it's about the movie Life of Pi. Yes, so they have a disagreement where Wilson thinks the movie is very an artistic masterpiece, if you will. It is very interesting, whereas Larry says, it's I found it very confusing and uninteresting and rather quite boring. When you see steps 3 and 4, they start to sort of name call, and Wilson starts to call Larry an idiot, and Larry seems starts to call Wilson a closed-minded snob. And this is like a serpentine because it gets to an end, or it boils down to essentially just who can come up with the best or most hurtful things to say. Because the original intention, which is like the tail of the snake, the original intention was to be talking about the movie The Life of Pi and people's thoughts on it. Whereas now it's just become throwing barbs and seeing what happens, trying to put others down to build yourself up. So essentially, that original meaning is completely lost. So it follows like a snake, like a serpentine model, which is kind of interesting. So then the third claim is we get what we make. So essentially, Pierce says you get out what you put in, and it's important to recognizing patterns of communication between those we communicate with. So often, professional relationships form from accusations and reactive anger, whereas more open relationships form from genuine questions and curiosity. So there might be relationships you have with people where it seems like they're coming from an air of malice, or they accuse you of different things, and they're not very open and learning about things, and they may have, again, it's complicated because the stories that are told and those things that people believe on and that person may believe on, they have the reasons for doing so, and we got to look at those stories that are not being told and really examine those. Um, and so Pierce also tells us that we must ask ourselves three very important questions. How did that social world get made? What are we making? What can we do to make better social worlds? So, when you're communicating with others, interacting with those around you, it's important to keep those three questions in mind, especially if you're communicating with someone and just doesn't seem like you're getting along, or you're coming in with different stripes and troubles. So, it's important to, again, ask yourself these three questions when it comes to your response, as well as what you say and what you think and how you perceive things. Like, how exactly did we get to this point? Like, what are we even doing, or what can we do to make a, what can we do to make a better world we can where we can figure each other out, or make attempts to figure out where we make standpoints and figure out where the other is coming from. And that comes with this point called the bifurcation point, which is, as the book says on page 72, a critical point in a conversation where what one says next will affect the unfolding pattern of interaction and potentially take it into a different direction. So the conversation may start following a serpentine like model, and they may get to a point where, and that's, I guess, if we go back, the bifurcation point would be around the third or fourth point, right around here, and you have a decision to make as a communicator. You can figure out, you can understand, like, what I say next is really important, and to figure out and to move forward with creating a better social world. And that has to do with something called mindfulness, which is as the book says on page 73, the presence or awareness of what participants are making in the midst of their own conversation. Pierce says it's the ability to create, or it's the ability to take oneself out of a situation or out of a conversation and really examine what will happen with what you say next. Because at the end of the day, what Pierce describes as a better social world is one with caring, compassion, love, and grace among one another. So it's important. So to achieve that, it's important to be mindful about what you say and why, and how you react to what others are saying about you or about things that are important to you. And finally, Pierce suggests the fourth claim is getting the pattern right creates better social worlds. So again, the social world, we want to create a social world of caring, compassion, love, and grace. And what does that exactly look like? Well, Pierce, and this would go contrary to the what Pierce and Vernon would want with their theory, is that to bring out an ideal world would only compel people to live within a specific vision, right? Because CMM is all about not exactly getting to those exact hard truths about things, but to become more mindful and aware of why people say things and the stances that they take, and learning to understand and learn that communication and what people say and think is a very complicated thing, and nothing is just, there's no simple solution or silver bullet answer to why people say certain things or believe, or how people react to certain things that are being said. So to then say, here is an ideal vision of what that looks like, you're forcing people into a mold rather than trying to figure out and understand one another. What happens is people that feel as though they are in that mold will try to convert others to be in that mold. And that goes exactly counter to CMM, because it's all about understanding one another. And that's all about the communicator being mindful. And that book says that presence and awareness of what participants are making in the midst of their conversations. Again, it's all about being mindful. And that's how you create these compassionate and graceful social worlds, and how you create healthy relationships, and also how you get through conflict as well. And the book brings up there's a proverb, 15:1, where it says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath." And that's all about being mindful. So, being mindful in situations will allow you to incur a more gentle answer rather than being harsher or coming across as rude. Um, and in doing so, you get to learn and grow with other people. You get to learn about people by having those gentle answers and not immediately creating or going down to that serpentine model where you completely ignore the bifurcation point. So, then to recap, the coordinated management of meaning theory is very complex and very multifaceted, much like communication. And I think that's quite poetic because, again, since the theory is complicated, and it's complicated because it suggests that communication is very multifaceted and absolutely complicated. And there's so many things we can try to create all these models and things, but at the end of the day, there's so much that we don't know and can't always consider when it comes to communication. Um, Next is that there is no universal truth in communication. The stories lived and the stories that we tell are two very, very different things. Because again, those are two very different mediums. The stories that we tell are through language, and the stories that we live through are through the body. And so language is a very innately different thing. So we try to, when we communicate and tell stories, it's all about trying to make sense of what happened to our bodies in that event. And those are innately two very different things. And finally, we can and will never know what the ideal social world looks like, and that is intentional by design because Pierce and Vernon did not want us to try to fit a certain mold and then try to convert others to join that mold. That's exactly the opposite of what Pierce wanted. Pierce wanted us to just understand one another, and if there are disagreements, then we, at the end of the day, we can still create a better social world, but have our own worldview and different ideologies and ideas about a vastly different subjects. So I kind of hope that was a good introduction to CMM. If you have any other questions, just let me know. And awesome. Thanks a ton. Just going to stop recording.